So I grew up in Indiana, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to be exact, up in the northeast corner where my parents still live. And I have lived my entire adult life in Indiana. So I have spent a remarkable number of hours of that life making that long drive north and south across Indiana on I-69. And while one could make the case that this drive is in fact stupendously boring, I actually really appreciate the view of the northern Indiana landscape from I-69. Those wide open fields dotted with the small clumps of trees, the neat rows of corn, the wildflowers, the long, low horizons which allow for these beautiful cloudscapes and sunsets. My Indiana is flat, 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 mostly farmlands and empty fields, at least until you get to the teeming megalopolis of Fort Wayne, Indiana, which has a Trader Joe's now, I'm told. I didn't appreciate as a child how much the Indiana I have always known is a human construct, is artificial. When I think of the natural Indiana landscape, it is anything but. In fact, when the American settlers first began moving Indiana in large numbers in the 1800s, when they began moving into land they took from native people through colonization, one must add, what they encountered was forest, swamp. Indiana in its pre-settler state was 90% forest. 20 million acres of forest in the state of Indiana. But the arrival of the American settlers led to aggressive clear-cutting and logging, and by the early 20th century, there were barely 1 million acres left. 95% of the Indiana forest had been destroyed by the beginning of the 20th century. And the imminent disappearance of all forest in Indiana triggered a conservation movement in the 1920s. And today, Indiana has regrown to about 4 million acres of forest, something to celebrate, but that is new forest. The forest that had been there before had been around for thousands of years, since the last ice age. So think about millions of acres of forest ecosystems that had flourished for thousands and thousands of years, wiped out in essentially one lifetime. Daniel Walker Howe, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, What God Hath Wrought, which is the history of America from 1815 to 1848, he notes that many of those American farmers in the early 1800s were using farming methods that were essentially unchanged since the Middle Ages, the Norman Conquest. They were using wooden hoes and free-ranging animals. And they were confronted with this vast expanse of land, which they had stolen, and there was no incentive to preserve the land. Land was cheap, and so the logic was to farm as much land as you possibly could with these incredibly inefficient methods and let the sheer scale of the operation turn that into a livelihood. Now, the native people before them had, of course, cultivated the land, and they had left their own footprint on the land. In fact, the Mississippians, who lived for about 400 years in Indiana, built great cities, supported by complex agriculture. The civilization disappeared for reasons that we don't know of, but they worked the land and they transformed the land, but the wholesale transformation and obliteration of the existing ecosystems was not something that they countenanced. But the American settlers went across the Midwest, forests and prairies like a great buzzsaw, leveling everything in their path. This is how Willa Cather described the prairie of her native Nebraska in the classic work of American literature, My Antonia. She wrote, "As I looked about me, I felt that the grass was the country as the water is the sea. The red of the grass made all the great prairie the color of wine stains or of certain seaweeds when they are first washed up. And there was so much motion in it, the whole country seemed somehow to be running." So once upon a time, the American Midwest was home to a vast ecosystem of those tall prairie grasses and the animals that made their home there. 240 million acres of prairie. And I remember when I first read Cather's descriptions of those oceans of red grass moving in the breeze, it caught my imagination. I had never pictured that before, and it made me long to experience it because I didn't know that the prairie was red like that. And for me, it isn't, and it won't be. Not anymore. Because by the 1930s, Willa Cather's beloved prairie was almost entirely gone, obliterated by the movement of American settlers. The grasses plowed under and turned into fields, the animals virtually exterminated. It is estimated that less than 1% of the prairie that she wrote about remains. And so today, in the place of the prairie that she immortalized in her fiction, there is the Willa Cather Memorial Prairie, a plot of 612 acres that conservationists are attempting to return to a pre-disturbed state so that visitors might get a glimpse of what the original might have looked like in Willa Cather's day. Now, conservation efforts, of course, are not new. The early 20th century saw the creation of our magnificent national park system and our state parks. The late 20th century launched the environmental movement, the EPA, the Endangered Species Act, the attempts to clean up our waterways right down to the Obama administration's protection of wetlands, and the fight over oil pipelines fought mainly by indigenous people. So today, as we close out our sermon series on audacious ideas in our relationships to animals, plants, and nature that we've been having together in November, I want to talk about one particular conservation movement, which is called rewilding. And I want to talk about rewilding not because I'm an expert and qualified to pontificate on whether this is in fact the best way to have conservation movement, but because it contains within it ideas that are challenging. It contains within it ideas that I think are spiritually fruitful and that call us to some degree to decenter ourselves as agents in the natural world. And I think as Unitarian Universalists, our values and our principles, particularly our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web, challenge us to question and to rethink our perspective and to decenter ourselves in the face of the claims of life. So, what is it? Rewilding is a conservation movement that has as its core philosophy the desire to create unmanaged wildlife areas, more and more unmanaged wildlife areas that are essentially returned to a pre-human, pre-disturbed state. So it believes that if ecosystems could be returned to something like their natural state, pre-encounter with humans, then those natural biological systems will be sort of self-sustaining without human intervention. It looks to replace the idea of these sort of human-managed wildlife preserves with much larger wild spaces that manage themselves. And the idea is that nature knows how to manage herself. So the movement, which was developed in the 90s, is based on three core ideas called the 3 Cs: core protected areas, carnivores, and connectivity or corridors. So the first one, core protected areas, is this idea to create large areas of unspoiled wilderness protected from human interference, and then we connect those protected areas through these natural corridors, that's the other C, that allow the animals to move about and allow the ecosystems to interact with one another. And the goal is to promote biodiversity, which has been so severely damaged by human activity that biologists now routinely refer to our human era as the 6th great extinction, the one caused by humans. Now, there's some radical rethinking of our relationship to nature at work here in the rewilding concept. The first C, core protected areas, asks us to countenance ever-expanding tracts of nature that are essentially human no-go zones, right? What are they for? Not for us. They are for other life to flourish apart from us. Now, of course, we benefit indirectly from biodiversity, right? Natural ecosystems continuously produce trillions of dollars of economic benefit for humans for free, right? They regenerate the soil, they clean the water, they filter the air, they trap the carbon, and we disrupt that ecosystem at our peril as we are learning, and biodiversity stabilizes ecosystems. But Americans, and maybe humans in general, are not so prone to appreciate the indirect benefits of allowing nature to do her thing over there totally undisturbed compared to the direct benefits of I could dig up that land and turn it into an iPhone 13. And let me be the first to admit, lest I be accused of hypocrisy, I love my iPhone so much. But the first C of rewilding asks us to decenter ourselves from the biome, right? It's challenging. It says we humans do not have to be everywhere. And we don't have to have everything that we want, even if we really want it. Not everything has to be for us and about us. And core protected areas also challenge our hubris that we can manage nature, something with which we have a mixed track record, let's say. So these are intended to be largely unmanaged areas where nature is left alone to do her thing. Now the second C, corridors. So this is controversial because it brings nature closer to home. And it asks us humans to sacrifice some freedom of movement to allow plants and animals greater freedom of movement. So the expansion of human activity and the building of roads and subdivisions has been kind of a disaster for wild animals. It has seriously constrained their freedom of movement. Their natural habitats have been chopped into bits. Their ability to range adaptively is restricted. This disrupts their lifestyles. It isolates them genetically, which leads to disease. And it prevents them from moving adaptively in response to climate change, which is something that all living things are going to have to do, but it's hard for animals and plants to do that. And so rewilders want to create these sort of protected natural corridors that would create contiguous open wildlife spaces so animals can get to where they need to go. And in some cases, this can look like the creation of animal highway crossings that allow animals to move safely past our highways, right? So I don't want us to think that this is like too theoretical. This is something that we're doing. According to a May 2021 story in the New York Times, in Wyoming, the Transportation Department got together with the state wildlife agencies and with nonprofit groups, and they created safe animal crossings for the deer along their traditional migratory routes, right? These giant, like, deer overpasses that go over the highways. And it was win-win because the deer can get to where they need to go and vehicle collisions decreased by 90%. 90%. And this is an idea now that is catching on across the country. These animal crossings, they looked like sort of fenced-in protective overpasses. Sometimes they are underpasses or tunnels. At first, they weren't sure, are the animals gonna like take to these things? But the animals quickly figured them out and used them very enthusiastically. And the idea was born out of a desire to protect human life and property, which is certainly a good thing. But environmentalists point out it is also a very good thing for animals and their ecosystems. There are now more than 1,000 dedicated animal crossings in the US, not just for deer, but for snakes, for amphibians, for alligators in Florida. And once the crossings exist, right, all kinds of animals use them, not just the ones for whom they were built. And of course, one very important benefit is that they have now flooded the internet with cute webcam footage of animals crossing through these corridors. So Google them if you haven't seen any of these videos. If you've seen the video of like the coyote and the badger that go through the tunnel together, and they like wait for each other, they're best friends crossing the highway. If that doesn't melt your heart, I just don't even know what, right? So Google that. Fox and badger, or coyote and badger cross the road if you haven't seen that. And the New York Times article sounds a cautionary note. Okay, scientists warn that even as wildlife crossings gain traction, they're only one piece of the work needed to reconnect these fragmented populations of wildlife. And they will backfire if they end up being used to get new roads approved in places where the impact to animals is too high, right? So they have to be used wisely. One environmentalist said, I want everyone to get super excited about animal crossings, and I want people to understand that they're a Band-Aid. The road is the wound. The road is the wound. So the creation of more corridors and more connected habitats, if we're serious about this, will necessarily and ultimately ask people to make different decisions about how we develop the land around us and how we expand our human habitations and how we just get from point A to point B. And as more animals are moving past us and moving around us, this also suggests that animal-human encounters could increase because we're learning to live in closer proximity to nature. And that closer proximity brings us to our third C, and this is where rewilding gets more controversial because the third C stands for carnivores. Rewilders believe that in order for natural ecosystems to self-manage, there need to be apex predators in the system. Apex predators, large carnivores, play a really important control mechanism in natural systems. But they have been reduced or nearly eliminated from most of the American landscape. So rewilding then would mean the reintroduction of wolves, of bears, of big cats, of coyotes, and other predators into the American landscape in greater numbers within these protected areas. So in the 1990s, you may be familiar, Yellowstone deliberately reintroduced wolves into the park. And the story is that wolves had been largely exterminated from the West by American settlers seeking to protect livestock. And the Yellowstone park managers were part of that. When Yellowstone was created, the wolves were viewed as a nuisance. And so the park managers actually killed all of the wolves in Yellowstone. They killed the last pack of wolves in 1926. They didn't really understand the connectedness of ecosystems at the time. They thought they were doing a good thing. But what happened was the elk population, without any predators to control it, just started exploding and crashing and exploding and crashing, which was bad for the animals. They suffered diseases, they starved, they died in pain. It was bad for the ecosystem. Whenever they exploded, they overgrazed the landscape, which had knockdown effects on all of the other animals trying to make a living there. So it wasn't a good thing. And beginning in 1995, then the idea was that wolves would be carefully reintroduced into Yellowstone Park. And when they did, what they found was that the wolves triggered a cascading series of changes all throughout the ecosystem that greatly increased plant and animal diversity. It stabilized the elk population so they weren't overgrazing, but also the elk behavior changed. They moved to different parts of the park to get away from the wolves. In particular, they stopped grazing down in the lowlands, and so the rivers changed and the riverbeds stabilized, and that created pockets of water for other ecosystems to thrive. And then the beaver came back because of this. And like all of these ripple effects, the reintroduction of wolves literally rerouted the rivers in Yellowstone Park. Everything is connected, and large predators have an important role to play. Now, the Yellowstone experiment is new. It's been 25 years, and the data is still being collected to understand all the changes and whether this will ultimately be considered a success. So I'm not saying that the science is 100% in, and the idea has its opponents. Not everyone is excited about reintroducing wolves into their backyard, and you can imagine why. And I think about the coyotes that are moving through suburban neighborhoods like Fishers, Indiana, preying on small dogs, and cats that are left unattended, right? Occasionally someone will catch a photo of a coyote like running right out in the open, running up the street. There's concern that they may be becoming more habituated to humans. The last time I visited my parents in good old Fort Wayne, just like a month ago, my parents warned me that there are coyotes now in the woods, like literally right across the street from their house. And they have to be mindful when they're walking their dogs in the park. No one wants an unexpected late night encounter with a coyote. Before we moved into Butler-Tarkington, my own family lived in what is technically Fishers, over kind of near that small airfield on Allisonville Road. I don't know if you know where that is. And if you wanted to get to our house to one of the nearby super shopping centers, the fastest thing to do was take a side road that wound behind that airport. So this is an area surrounded by open fields and small woods. So it was kind of an incongruous little jaunt. You would go from like the suburbs to the big box stores by way of this little patch of like cornfields and woods that was just plopped down in our neighborhood. And one night as I was driving back there behind the airport, I saw a pack of coyotes come traipsing across the field. It was adults and children. There must have been, 8 or 9 of them. And they trotted parallel to my car across the open field. They were unconcerned by my presence. And I just kind of stopped and watched them moving across the cornfields in the moonlight. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. It was a blessing. And then finally they disappeared into the cornfields. And it was a little sobering too, if I'm being real, because this was not a mile from my house, where I walk my dogs at night and where my children's biked to their friends. And experts are saying coyotes are probably now a permanent fixture of city life, and we're going to have to learn how to live together. And so I close this sermon series, as we've been re-examining our relationship to plants, to animals, to the natural world. I close this sermon series with the thought that one of the imperatives of the coming century is precisely that we have to learn how to live together with the natural world from which we have been too long estranged, too long removed. And this will mean, in some cases, decentering our human concerns to allow non-human life more space for their concerns. It will mean expanding the concept of being a good neighbor to include our non-human neighbors. It will mean learning to live with beings whose ways are very different than our own. And so rewilding challenges us to countenance an intentional shrinking of our human domain, an intentional pulling back for the benefit of all of our kin, and a way of living in a more respectful harmony. And the great Midwestern poet and farmer Wendell Berry has been writing about this vision his entire life. And so I want to close today and close this sermon series with his poem, which is simply titled Vision. If we will have the wisdom to survive, to stand like slow-growing trees on a ruined place, renewing it, enriching it, if we will make our seasons welcome here, asking not too much of earth or heaven, then a long time after we are dead, our lives prepare will live there. Their houses strongly placed upon the valley sides, fields and gardens, rich in the windows. The river will run clear as we will never know it. And over it, bird song like a canopy. On the levels of the hills will be green meadows, stock bells in noonshade. On the steeps where greed and ignorance cut down the old forest, an old forest will stand, its rich leaf fall drifting on its roots. The veins of forgotten springs will have opened. Families will be singing in the fields, and in their voices they will hear a music risen out of the ground. They will take nothing from the ground, they will not return, whatever the grief at parting. Memory native to this valley will spread over it like a grove, and memory will grow into legend, legend into song, song into sacrament. The abundance of this place, the song of its people and its birds, will be the health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is no paradisal dream. Its hardship is its possibility. This is no paradisal dream. Its hardship is its possibility. Blessed be, and amen.